As you can see from the table in front of us, we want to discuss assault weapons here in Milwaukee to let you know that this issue, although it is front and center on the national stage, is also front and center here locally as well. And the reason we wanted to bring you here today is to show you some of the weapons that the Milwaukee police have seized during the course of their everyday work. The chief will go over the numbers that have occurred since he has been in office. But if you take a look at the gun which is the third from the end of the table here. That's the military version is M16. The civilian version is AR-15. That is essentially the gun that allegedly was used in the slaughter that took place in Connecticut last week. Guns like this are present in Milwaukee. They're present on the streets of Milwaukee, and the brave men and women who work for this fantastic department put their lives on the line every day, trying to do what they can to take these guns off the street and make this a safer city. The unspeakable tragedy in Newtown has brought light to the severity of gun violence in our country. Gun violence claims the lives of 34 Americans every day. Our families and neighborhoods are being torn apart every day. We absolutely cannot wait any longer to stop this madness. Now is the time for our national and state policymakers to take action, to support the efforts of our brave men and women, and to prevent further tragedies, to save lives. And to do that, we need action. We're very specific in what we are looking for. Most Americans support the right to own guns. I support the Second Amendment. A vast majority of Americans support the Second Amendment. But Americans are surprised, many Americans are surprised when they learn that many individuals purchase guns basically when they are not allowed to do so under law. What I'm talking about specifically is people with criminal records, people with domestic violence orders against them, people with mental health adjudications can purchase guns in this country simply by avoiding federal gun dealers. In other words, they can go to gun shows and purchase them from individuals there who are not registered or licensed gun dealers. They can go online. They can go to private sales, and they can completely avoid the law. And when people find it out, their reaction is, well, this is not the way it should happen. People support the right to own guns, but they do not support having people with criminal records, mental health adjudications, or domestic violence orders having possession of guns. So we are asking that there be a mandatory criminal background check on all gun sales. It's straightforward. Mandatory background check on all gun sales. That we do that by fixing the gaping loopholes in our gun laws that make it far too easy for dangerous people to get their hands on guns. We're asking that there be a ban on military-style weapons with high-capacity magazines that don't belong on our streets. Again, taking a look at the gun we have here that I pointed to, that magazine might hold 10, 15 bullets. But talking to one of the officers before we started, there are magazines that can hold 50, 60, 90 bullets that can be attached to this gun. And we've had some commentators saying, well, what we need people to do is we need people to rush an assailant. If someone is holding that gun and there are 50 bullets in that magazine, you rush that assailant and you are going to be dead. So my view is you do not need 50, 60, 70 bullets to shoot a deer. And even if you're dealing with self-defense, you don't need 50, 60, 70 bullets in a magazine for self-defense. At the local level, we're asking the state legislature to do things that are rather straightforward. Prevent habitual criminals from getting a concealed carry permit. What we have right now is we have a situation where individuals who are under our law considered habitual criminals because they have numerous misdemeanors. And these may be misdemeanors that have been adjudicated for them after being pled down from felonies. They can still get concealed carry permit here in the state of Wisconsin. We are asking that these individuals who are habitual criminals under Wisconsin state law be prevented from getting a CCW permit. We're asking the state legislature to create a law that will deal with the issue of straw purchasers. We're asking the state to prosecute straw purchasers, people who buy guns for people who are prohibited from owning guns. The reality of what we see in the city is we see individuals who by law cannot purchase a gun. And what do? They get their girlfriend, they get their brother, they get a friend to go in and purchase the gun for them. It should be a felony for them to do that. We must create a culture of gun safety in our country. Ironically, 74% of NRA members and 87% of non-NRA gun owners support requiring criminal background checks of anyone purchasing a gun. Why do they do that? Because it's common sense. Background checks are the only systematic way to stop felons, domestic abusers, and other dangerous people from buying firearms. As I mentioned earlier, military-style weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines have no appropriate civilian or sporting function. They are designed to kill people quickly. That's what they're designed to do, and what we have seen tragically over and over again is that they work very effectively. Approximately 1 out of 5 law enforcement officials slain in line of duty is killed with assault weapons. So again, when I talk about these guns being seized by Milwaukee police officers, they are at risk of losing their own lives because these guns are on the streets of our city. 40% of gun sales in the United States go through without a background check under federal law. Those are the gun show loophole sales, those are the private sales, those are some of the internet sales. In an investigation conducted by Mayors Against Illegal Guns, 62% of private gun sellers on the internet agreed to sell a firearm to buyers who said they probably couldn't pass a background check. So these guns are not being sold accidentally. The people selling these guns, avoiding the background check, know that 60%, or should know that 60% of these private gun sellers are selling them to people who shouldn't and cannot, under law, have these guns. 87% of NRA members agree that support for Second Amendment rights goes hand in hand with keeping guns out of hands of criminals. And that's what this is all about. We support the Second Amendment, but we also support keeping the guns out of hands of felons and others who should not have them. Finally, again, to make sure that people in this community know that our concerns are not academic concerns. In 2009, 4 Milwaukee police officers were shot, including officers Brian Norberg and Graham Kunish, who were shot by an 18-year-old on the near south side. In 2007, Milwaukee officers Jose Lopez and Alex Arce were shot by a teenage gang member. All 4 of these officers have sued the gun dealer responsible for the sale of weapons used in the shootings. And everyone in this community knows that it was only a short time ago that Oak Creek Police Lieutenant Brian Murphy was shot multiple times by the gunman at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin. We have to stop this, and it's going to take action at the state level and the federal level. I'd like to ask Chief Flynn to come and give you his perspective on this from a frontline perspective. Chief?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for coming here today. Obviously, the dramatic and tragic events of last week in Connecticut call upon all of us to be part of the solution to the problem of gun violence in America. Clearly, any conversation has to start with the stipulation that we're the only country that has firearms mentioned in its founding document. We have to recognize that it's a strongly held belief and a constitutional right to keep and bear arms. But what we must not do is retreat to the same old tired debates that occur every time there's a national tragedy. We've got to stop yelling at each other, and we have to start talking to each other. And we must balance talk of individual rights with talk of mutual responsibility. Now, we have before us evidence of the proliferation of military-style assault weapons in the hands of arrested criminals, placing the lives of officers and of innocents at risk as they ply their deadly trade. Now, mass murder may never be a curable event. Gun violence in America may not be curable events in the aggregate, but we can make it harder to commit mass murder. We can make it harder for criminals to procure firearms to continue their deadly ways. Now, let me give you a few data points. Since 2008, when I was sworn in, the Milwaukee Police Department has seized from the streets of Milwaukee 10,680 firearms. 2,200 of those were rifles, and 264 of those weapons were military-style assault weapons. Over that same period of time, since I've been here, 28 children under the age of 13 have been shot on the streets of Milwaukee. During that same period of time, we have had numerous firearms shootings and woundings in the last 2 years. In 2011, we had 87 homicides, 60 of which were gun homicides. In 2012, we've had 86 homicides, 69 of them, 80%, have been committed with firearms. In the last 2 years, we have had over 1,000 non-fatal shootings on the streets of our city. We have two types of firearms problems confronting us in America, and they require attempts at solutions at different levels of government. The problem of mass murder is a problem that can only be addressed at the federal level because of the implements of destruction require common regulations across state lines. Now, I'm a member of the Major City Chiefs Association. Those are the police chiefs of the 50 biggest cities in the United States of America. And we have basically a position on firearms laws not dissimilar from that of the Mayors Against Illegal Guns. Major city chiefs want legislation that bans high-capacity magazines, those that hold greater than 10 rounds apiece. We want to see legislation that requires that unlicensed private sales, such as those that take place at gun shows, still require a criminal record check, just as one does through a licensed federal firearms dealer. We want to see the assault weapons ban reinstated, and we want to encourage stiffer penalties for possession of illegal firearms. We want to ban the internet sale of ammunition and require in-person transactions and records of sales and licenses of ammunition vendors. We believe that given the fact that during the term that the Brady Bill existed, there was a decrease in crimes committed with assault weapons of 66% during the era that that law was in force. We would hope to see similar results if we reintroduced that ban. Now, we recognize that there are millions of weapons already in the hands of Americans. We recognize that we continue to be challenged by firearms that are stolen, not just firearms that are legally purchased. But that does not excuse inaction and pleas of helplessness. Our citizens overwhelmingly want to see intelligent gun control, whether they are firearms owners, NRA members, or not. But people have spoken again and again. Professional law enforcement has spoken again and again. And it's time for craven legislators to stop hiding behind their metal detectors and their police force in Congress and join the rest of Americans who are vulnerable to gun violence by assisting them in making those first important steps to address it. This requires bipartisanship. It requires discussion. A year ago, I was quoted in a newspaper as saying that I couldn't believe that there was any event horrifying enough that would finally cause Congress to act. Well, maybe 20 dead babies is it. Just maybe. It remains to be seen. Sadly, we've been down this road many times before and been met only with inaction. When it comes to the state level, the state is better positioned than the federal government is to reduce the kind of firearms violence that plagues Milwaukee. We have put forward an eminently reasonable and narrowly defined package to reform the gun laws of Wisconsin. And that's the key. Whether it's federal law or state law, those laws must be narrowly focused on the problem we're trying to fix. We can't allow people to try to paint narrow solutions as broad-based bans on people's rights. These have to be narrowly focused. We have to be narrowly focused on things like assault weapons and ammunition capacity, because we've seen what lack of regulation can do. When it comes to dealing with firearms here in Wisconsin, the murderous violence on the streets of Milwaukee is overwhelmingly committed by criminals. 85% of our shooting victims have criminal records. But the problem is those weapons are high-quality weapons legally purchased by straw purchasers. That's got to change. It has got to be a felony to buy a gun for a criminal. Secondly, we are the only state that I know of that it's a misdemeanor to illegally carry a concealed weapon. If you are in gang life, if you are in criminal life, it is more dangerous for you to get caught without your gun than to get caught with it. That's got to change. We have got to make it a felony with a sentence attached that's mandatory for somebody illegally possessing a firearm. Surely our colleagues in the legislature must see the logic of this. Thirdly, right now our permitting process allows habitual criminals to get gun permits. We've already encountered them on the street. These are people with criminal assault records, criminal records being arrested sometimes for serious crimes, but given the nature of the pressures of urban jurisdictions, not convicted for felonies. They can legally get a gun and carry it in this state. That's an absurdity. Please help us reduce the violence here. We'd like to see convicted felons kept 1,000 feet from a gun store. Why? Well, because usually the straw purchaser gets out of the car having been just told exactly what kind of gun to buy by their boyfriend. Let's keep him far away from the store. Let's at least make it a little more inconvenient to try to do that. So there's two levels of challenge of gun violence in this country. Both are worthy of discussion. One conversation has to start at the state level, and that's how can the state help us reduce the fact that we have got so many victims of firearms violence in this city. 80% of our homicide victims are shot to death. Can you imagine if we could reduce homicides by 80%? We need help to do that. We cannot do it alone. And when it comes to the federal level, only federal laws make sense to regulate the types of weapons used to commit mass murder. This is a distinctly American problem, the problem of mass murder. Surely we can fashion a distinctly American solution. Thank you. Mr. Representative?
Thank you. I'm State Representative John Richards, and I had the honor of representing the city of Milwaukee in the state legislature. 3 years ago, I was part of a bipartisan coalition that worked together to keep guns out of the hands of people who have been involuntarily committed for mental illness. We passed that law in part in response to a constituent of mine whose son was bipolar, was institutionalized, and came out and bought a gun and killed himself. That story moved the legislature to act. After the Yazana shooting, where Radcliffe Houghton had a restraining order against him with a judicial order saying that he couldn't have a gun, and then 2 days later, in violation of that order, he was able to go online and get a gun that he used for his rampage in Brookfield. In the conversations I've had with people in the legislature, I'm hoping that we can all agree that we need to obey judicial orders, and those should be followed, and that we should have a law in place that requires a background check to ensure those orders are followed. And now with this horrendous shooting, in what should be the brightest season of the year, has turned into one of the darkest hours of this nation, where 20 children were gunned down in an elementary school. I hope that the halls of the Capitol have room for a bipartisan discussion of what we have to do next. And I hope there's room for a bipartisan discussion of obeying the law. And one of the ways that we can do that is by having a mandatory background checks on all weapons sales. I'm introducing a bill shortly after the first of the year, and I hope that we'll be able to have a bipartisan coalition to pass that bill. And there are bipartisan steps we can take across the nation too. 20 years ago, Ronald Reagan was one of the most enthusiastic advocates of an assault weapons ban that passed Congress. In that spirit, I hope that we're able to have a strong bipartisan result in Washington. But no matter what happens in Washington, we should act here in Wisconsin. Wisconsin has always led when the well-being of our citizens is at stake, and this should be a moment when we should also lead. Thank you.
Are there any questions? I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Chief, this question directed to you, sir. The NRA for years has said they are strong supporters of law enforcement. I don't think anyone would dispute that. Yet they often oppose the very kinds of laws that you proposed in your address. Why is that?
The NRA has very disingenuously for years done a lot of training for police officers on firearms, and they run some very good firearms courses. They have never taken a public policy position that truly supported law enforcement. Law enforcement for a generation has been advocating for common sense limitations on unfettered access to firearms. You know, we've strongly supported criminal background checks. We've strongly supported, the assault weapons ban. We strongly, supported bans on high-capacity magazines because we're experienced with dealing with the deadly violence of our communities. We'd like our opinions thought of as expert opinions. The NRA does not support law enforcement, or it would be responding to the murders of law enforcement officers rather than responding to the apparent need to arm their assailants more easily. And that is the logical output of all of their legislation. They are a powerful, small, well-funded lobby group. That's all they are. Even gun orders don't support their positions, and it's time for our legislators to disenthrall themselves of the power of this group. It's time to write a new book of profiles in courage, and this has got to be the first chapter.
What would you expect them to say tomorrow at their national news conference?
The NRA. They are probably going to extend their condolences and then start talking about rights again. Well, you know what? That's a very difficult discussion to have. But there was a time when slavery existed in the Constitution too. But Abraham Lincoln got the notion that the Declaration of Independence guaranteed that everybody was created equal. What seems to me the Declaration of Independence also says that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among those are life. And I would like to think that the Declaration of Independence guarantee that to guarantee life is one of the reasons governments are instituted among men. Maybe that has a bearing on how we interpret and reasonably regulate the Second Amendment. Every amendment in the Constitution is subjected to reasonable regulation. Every amendment. That's why there are libel laws that govern the First Amendment. Every amendment has reasonable regulations. The Second Amendment can be no exception, and when the Supreme Court extended the Second Amendment to individuals, it also said specifically reasonable regulations are entirely within the intent of the Constitution. That conversation's got to start. We got to get beyond the yelling at each other, all right, and start talking about how do we limit the likelihood that the kind of horrific events we saw last Friday occur again.
Time for one more question.
How do you combat the situation where there are millions of these guns, millions of high-capacity mags out there already?
Well, clearly there are many of these guns out there. And I think the real issue is the magazines, because people are going to continue to own these guns. And even if there is a ban on them, there is not going to be a confiscation of them, would be my belief. But at some point, you're not going to be able to, if you cannot purchase a magazine that holds 50, 60, 70 bullets, that's going to help address the problem. And I think that's a big part of what we're talking about here today.
There's also one other thing that I might add to that, Mr. Mayor, and that's, one thing you can think about, and, it's true, there's 300 million guns out there already. Number one, nobody's looking to confiscate all of your firearms, all right, because that's the first place when the debate starts to go down the rabbit hole, that's what happens. They're going to come take our guns away. That's not what this discussion is about. We're trying to limit the likelihood of certain kinds of conduct. Second thing is, gun buyback programs generally don't work because they're small amounts of money and everybody brings in grandpa's flintlock. If you're going to do gun buyback and you want to get assault rifles off the street, then maybe we ought to take some of our drug confiscation money. I'll give you $1,000 for an assault rifle. All right, put the profit motive in it. Buy the darn things back for what they're worth if we need to get there someday. But the bottom line is, as the mayor just said, a lot of people out there with assault weapons are never going to hurt anybody. But the fact of the matter is those high-capacity magazines really create that situation the mayor alluded to. There's 25 teachers in that school. They could not rush him because he didn't have to reload for 50 or 60 shots. Everybody's dead. All right? In the olden days, somebody went in there with a 6-shooter, they fired their 6 shots, you had a chance if you were unarmed. This takes away that chance. You know, the streets of our cities should not be subject to being free fire zones. And so going after how many bullets you can walk around with your legal weapon, I think is a reasonable limitation that reasonable people on both sides of the issue of who can hold what kind of guns should be able to come to some kind of consensus on.
Chief, you talked about some of the weapons statistically that you've confiscated, that your officers have confiscated. Aren't there many cases, though, where the people in those houses or what have you have been able to go back to court to get their weapon back? Do you have some statistics on that?
I don't have those statistics, but the majority of the weapons we seized are in the possession of criminals, and we get to hold on to them. But yes, you are correct. There are circumstances in which a seized weapon can be reclaimed.
Hey, Chief, the representative mentioned a guy who was bipolar and used a gun, I think, out in Brookfield. What percentage of people that your officers come into contact with would you estimate have some sort of mental illness? Not just people with guns, just in general.
Well, that's a very important discussion that the mayor and I have recently had. One of the disconcerting things I learned when I was a Secretary of Public Safety was one of the departments that reported to me was Department of Correction. And it was there in Massachusetts that I learned that the Department of Correction was the largest mental health facility in the Commonwealth. And as we looked into it more, we began to realize that, back in the heyday of deinstitutionalization, the mantra was community-based treatment. It never happened. Every state in the country wildly cut back expenditures on mental illness treatment in order to save money. I think currently Wisconsin ranks 25th in the country on what it spends on mental illness, and that includes the Department of Correction budget. We're left with a situation where my cops are out there in the middle of the night dealing with people who have mental illness or a dual diagnosis. They have mental illness and substance abuse problems, and no one will accept them. Now, I know a lot of people decry how many people are in jail at any given time, but American society has delegated mental illness to the criminal justice system. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, when there is somebody on the streets of Wisconsin Avenue, addled, and possibly a danger to themselves at least, and we can't get them committed anywhere, we have no tool but to arrest them. So yes, while we're talking about this, it's not an either or. Clearly, rational discussion has to go about the reasonable regulations of the implements of destruction. But obviously, it's past time for American society to reconsider how it is, just as a moral issue, we treat the mentally ill. Because right now, mental illness is a criminal justice problem, not a public health problem, and that's just plain wrong.